Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. A landing craft grinds toward the Normandy shore in the smoke of the third wave, and pressed against its steel side is a 21-year-old corporal named Waverly Woodson. He is a medic. He is African American, and by the reckoning of the army that shipped him here, he is the last kind of soldier anyone expects to matter on this beach. He has done everything right. He scored high enough on the Army aptitude test to be sent to officer candidate school, one of only a handful of black men in his course. He trained until the medical drills became reflex. He learned to splint a shattered leg by feel, to pack a wound while a man screams, to find a vein in a body sliding into shock. He carries the knowledge of a college pre-medical student and the hands of a soldier drilled past exhaustion. By any fair measure, he has earned his place here twice over. None of that is why he is on this landing craft. He is here because the army decided that men like him could not lead, and so it made them serve instead. He was pulled off the path to an officer's commission, not for any failure of his own, but because there was simply no place in the Coast Artillery for a black officer. The rules of the day held that a black officer could not command white men junior to him, and the quotas were narrow, and so the door quietly closed in his face. He was handed a medical kit and folded into a segregated unit that the United States military establishment, in its own official documents, had already judged unfit to fight. And then the ramp is about to drop, and the sea in front of him is on fire, and the men who wrote him off are nowhere near this water. There is only Woodson, his kit, and a beach that does not care in the slightest what anyone assumed about him. A German shell finds the craft before it can land. The blast drives metal through his groin, his inner thigh, his back. The man standing beside him is killed outright. Woodson reaches down toward the pain, brings his hand back up, and sees it slick with his own blood. He thinks, very plainly, that he is dying. He does not die. And in the next 30 hours, this soldier that his own country had quietly filed away as a liability will do something so far beyond anything predicted for him that, 80 years later, a United States senator will still be fighting to have it fully recognized. What happened on that sand is not really a story about a man exceeding expectations. It is a story about how completely wrong the expectations were in the first place. And it is a story about who gets believed and who gets remembered when the official record goes missing. Here is the strange thing about Woodson's story, the detail that turns a war record into a genuine puzzle. The doubt cast over him did not come from the enemy waiting on the bluffs above Omaha. It came from his own side. It had been written down, stamped, and filed away years before he ever set foot near a beach. Most soldiers who are underestimated as individuals. A sergeant decides a recruit is too small, or too slow, or too green, and the recruit proves him wrong. One push-up, one march, one firefight at a time. Woodson's case was different in kind. The judgment against him was never about Waverly Woodson at all. He had been assessed, in advance and in bulk, as a member of a category, sorted before he had done anything to be sorted by. The army had reached a firm conclusion about what he was capable of before it had ever seen him lift a finger. His actual competence was, in a strange and cruel sense, beside the point, because the verdict had been arrived at without reference to any real person named Woodson. There is a particular sharpness to Woodson's version of this because of how close he came to the other path. He had done exactly what an ambitious, capable young man was supposed to do. He had gone to Lincoln University, a historically black institution, and set his sights on becoming a doctor. He had scored high on the Army's own tests, high enough that the Army itself selected him for officer training and sent him to learn the artillery officer's trade. In another skin, that trajectory ends with bars on his shoulders and a command of his own. Instead, it ended at a wall. The Army had trained him toward leadership, and then informed him that leadership was not available to him, and it did all of this using its own measurements, its own tests, its own selection process. It found him qualified and then disqualified him for a reason that had nothing to do with any of the qualifications. That is a specific kind of cruelty, to be told by the same institution, in the same breath, that you are good enough and that it does not matter. That is the puzzle at the very heart of this. How does a man disprove a conclusion that was never about him to begin with? How do you outperform an assumption that will not even bother to watch you perform? Woodson could be the single finest medic on that entire beach, and within the internal logic of the system that had sent him there, it would change nothing about the label he carried. The label came first, the soldier came second. This is the machinery he was truly fighting, long before any German gunner ever found his boat. And it explains a bitter phrase that recurs across the whole history of black service in that war, spoken by one of Woodson's own comrades in the same battalion. Our biggest enemy, the man said, was our own troops. To understand how large that enemy really was, you have to look past Woodson for a moment, out to the numbers, because the doubt he carried onto the sand was not a mood, and it was not a passing rumor. It was policy. It was applied, deliberately and systematically, to well over 1 million men. More than 1.2 million African Americans served in the United States Armed Forces during the Second World War. They served in a military that was segregated by official design, from the very top to the very bottom. In 1939, before the enormous wartime expansion began, the entire United States Army contained only 3,640 black soldiers, every last one of them serving under white officers. When the draft arrived, it inducted black men in rough proportion to their share of the national population, roughly 1 in 10, but it kept them rigidly apart, separate units, separate barracks, separate mess halls, even separate supplies of blood plasma in some cases. It was a separate war, running quietly alongside the one that everyone remembers, and the army kept these men, overwhelmingly, out of the actual fighting. Of the roughly 900,000 African Americans who served in the army, about 78% were placed into the service branches. These were the engineers, the quartermasters, the transportation units, the men who moved the endless mountains of supply, who built and repaired the roads, who unloaded the ships under fire, who dug the graves and buried the dead. By the summer of 1945, 93% of black soldiers in the army were serving in the service forces. 2 out of every 3 black soldiers were, in the words of one historian of the period, denied the right to prove themselves in combat at all. They were treated as utterly indispensable to the war effort and walled off from its defining act at the very same time. This did not happen by accident. And, crucially for Woodson's story, it did not happen without a paper trail. The intellectual foundation for the whole arrangement was a single army study, written in October 1925 at the United States Army War College. Its title was blunt and clinical: The Use of Negro Manpower in War. It was prepared under the direction of the college's commandant, and it drew heavily on the biased testimony of white officers, reflecting back on the performance of black troops in the First World War. Its conclusions hardened into doctrine, and its language is difficult to read even now, across a full century. The black soldier, the report claimed, was by his very nature subservient, and believed himself to be inferior to the white man. He could not control himself in the face of danger, it stated flatly, to the degree that a white man could. He lacked, in the report's own phrasing, the initiative and the resourcefulness of the white man. This was not the private grumbling of one bigoted officer scribbling in a notebook. It was an institutional finding of the United States Army, committed to paper, circulated widely, and treated as established fact. And it shaped the assignments, the expectations, and the ceilings placed over black soldiers for the next 20 years, right up until the very morning Woodson's boat approached the sand at Omaha. The historian Matthew Delmont, who wrote one of the major modern accounts of black service in that war, described precisely what that single document did across time. It took the racist assumptions of one generation of white officers, the men of the First World War, and it passed those assumptions forward, intact, to the next generation, almost all of whom would go on to serve in the Second. The report did not merely insult the men of 1925, it reached across 2 full decades and helped to shape the war that the men of 1944 would be permitted to fight, and the narrow roles they would be permitted to fight it in. Woodson lived inside that machine every single day that he wore the uniform. When his troop train crossed from the north down into the segregated south, the black soldiers aboard had to rise and move themselves into separate cars, sometimes cars with a curtain physically drawn across them, as though their own comrades in arms needed to be shielded from the mere sight of them. At Camp Tyson in Tennessee, the Army's training center for its barrage balloon units, he served under white officers drawn deliberately from the South, because the War Department had convinced itself that Southern officers best understood how to, in the ugly language of the era, handle black men. He endured the wake-ups at 2 in the morning and the 25-mile hikes under full kit, and he watched, more than once, German and Italian prisoners of war being served hot meals inside restaurants that would not seat a black American soldier wearing his own country's uniform. The captured enemy could eat inside in the warmth. The American medic had to remain outside in the cold. That last detail is worth sitting with, because it captured the whole absurdity of the arrangement in a single scene. A black soldier, training to defend a country at war, could be turned away hungry from a lunch counter, while the captured soldiers of the enemy that country was fighting, men who had until recently been trying to kill Americans, were shown to a table and served. The uniform of the United States, worn by a black man, counted for less in that moment than the uniform of the German army worn by a prisoner. Soldiers of the 320th would remember scenes exactly like that one for the rest of their lives, and more than a few of them would say, plainly, that it stung far worse than anything the enemy ever did to them across the water. Against all of that, Black America was quietly fighting a war of its own, on 2 fronts at once, and it had given that war a name. In February 1942, the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the great and influential black newspapers of the day, launched what it called the Double V campaign. The idea had come from a letter written to the paper by a young defense plant worker named James Thompson, who asked, in plain and painful terms, whether he should sacrifice his life to live only half American. The 2 letters of the campaign stood for 2 victories that, the paper argued, had to be won together, or they were not truly worth the winning at all. Victory over fascism abroad, and victory over racism at home. You could not, the campaign insisted, honestly ask a man to die for a freedom that his own country would not permit him to hold. That was the deeper war that Woodson carried quietly in his chest as he rode toward the beach, stowed away right alongside the medical kit slung over his shoulder. So the doubt was real, it was vast, and it was official, printed and filed and enforced across an entire army, which is exactly what makes everything that follows so difficult to explain by the doubters' own logic, because the very unit they were so certain would fail was about to be handed one of the most dangerous jobs on the most consequential morning of the entire war, and it was about to do that job in a way that the men who wrote the 1925 report could never have accounted for, and would not have believed, even if they had watched it happen. If the assumptions baked into that report had been correct, the men of the 320th should have cracked and run under the first real pressure. Everything that follows is the documented record of them refusing to break, and I want to be careful here, honestly careful, because this is exactly the kind of story that can drift from history into comfortable legend if nobody bothers to hold the line. So I am going to stay tight to what the surviving documents genuinely support. As it happens, they support a great deal more than the doubters would ever have guessed. Before we return to the beach and to Woodson himself, it is worth taking a moment to understand what his unit actually did, because the mission was strange, and it was dangerous, and it has been very nearly erased from the popular memory of the invasion. The 320th was a barrage balloon battalion. To modern ears, that phrase sounds almost quaint, almost gentle. It was neither of those things. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, very low altitude, was the only barrage balloon unit put ashore in France on D-Day, and it was the only all-black combat unit to land on the Normandy beaches that morning. Its job was to fly balloons over the invasion beaches, but the purpose of those balloons was to shield tens of thousands of desperately vulnerable men from sudden death falling straight out of the sky. Here is how the weapon actually worked, because it is a genuine and largely forgotten piece of wartime engineering. Each very low-altitude balloon ran roughly 35 feet in length and was filled with more than 3,000 cubic feet of hydrogen gas. Hydrogen is violently flammable, a fact that mattered enormously to the men who had to handle and inflate these things while under enemy fire. The balloon itself was never the weapon. The steel cable that tethered it to the earth was the weapon. Flown a couple of 100 feet up, and higher still when the situation called for it, a whole field of these tethered balloons transformed the air above a beach into a lethal trap. A German fighter plane coming in low to strafe the landing troops, or a dive bomber trying to place its bomb with any real precision, risked catching a wing or a propeller against an almost invisible steel cable strung directly across its path. A cable like that, struck at speed, could shear the wing clean off an aircraft. Some of the cables were even rigged with small explosive charges to finish the job for certain. The real genius of the system lay entirely in its economy. The balloon did not have to hit anything at all. It simply had to exist, hanging there in the open air, and by existing, it forced the enemy pilot to climb, to stay high, to bomb from an altitude where his aim came apart and his bombs scattered wide and harmless. A thin, ragged screen of balloons floating over the sand could protect thousands of men crowded beneath it, and it did so without firing a single shot. The men who flew them were, in a very real sense, building an invisible fence across the open sky and daring the German Air Force to fly straight into it. The 320th trained for all of this at Camp Tyson, the Army's only barrage balloon center, working through weeks of balloon handling drills and a long, demanding course in reading the weather, because a balloon is entirely at the mercy of the wind, and the men flying it had to anticipate exactly what the sky would do next. At full strength, the battalion numbered around 1,100 men. The force it committed to the invasion itself was 621 soldiers, scattered across more than 150 separate landing craft, split between both Omaha and Utah beaches. And when the men hit a hard practical problem, they solved it themselves. The heavy motorized winch that was supposed to reel the steel cables in and out kept sinking uselessly into the soft sand and the surf. So they improvised, refitting small field winches, each weighing only about 35 pounds, onto jeeps, giving themselves a workable way to raise and lower their balloons on a beach that was still very much under fire. This was, one cannot help but note, precisely the sort of initiative and resourcefulness that the 1925 report had solemnly sworn these men did not possess. Camp Tyson itself is worth a moment, because it was the strange proving ground where all of this began. Tucked away near Paris, Tennessee, it was the only place in the entire country where the Army trained men to fly barrage balloons. More than 30 barrage balloon battalions passed through it over the course of the war, and of all of those, only 4 were all-black units. The 320th was one of the 4. These were men learning a genuinely technical trade, mastering the physics of lift and wind and gas and steel cable, sitting through long courses in meteorology so they could predict the behavior of the sky. It was skilled, demanding, scientific work. And the men who did it were the same men the Army had decided, on paper, were incapable of initiative. The contradiction was baked into the place from the very first day. No other army at Normandy fielded anything quite like this, an all-black battalion doing this particular and perilous job in this particular place at this particular moment in history. And every one of the men doing it had been told, by the very institution that had trained and armed him, that he was not the fighting kind. Hold on to that contradiction as we move forward, because the beach is about to stretch it all the way to the breaking point. For the men of the 320th, the neat theory of the balloon fence collided with the brutal reality of Omaha Beach in the first grey light of June 6th, and the reality very nearly swallowed them whole. This is the place in the story where you see the job done for real, at its full and terrible price. The great pre-invasion bombardment was supposed to have shattered the German defences arrayed along the bluffs above the beach. It had not. The naval guns and the heavy bombers had, in far too many cases, missed the fortified strongpoints entirely, leaving them intact and fully manned. And so the men of the 320th came ashore into a wall of fire that was almost completely undiminished. Many of their balloons were shot to ribbons before the crews could even walk them down off the ships. On Utah Beach, some of the balloons were deliberately cut loose and released empty into the sky, abandoned, because commanders had begun to fear that the tethered targets floating overhead were actually helping the German artillery walk its fire down onto the men crowded on the sand below them. The men flying the balloons were doing all of this with tanks of hydrogen strapped to equipment that enemy shells and tracer rounds were passing through constantly. A single spark in the wrong place could turn a balloon into a fireball. They handled the gas, wrestled the cables, and read the wind while the beach around them was being torn apart, and they kept at it not for an hour or two but for days on end. And yet, in spite of every bit of it, the battalion did its work. By late in the evening of that first day, June 6th, there was a single balloon flying over the eastern end of Omaha Beach. By the dawn of June 7th, there were 12 of them aloft. By the night of the 7th, roughly 20 balloons floated protectively over Omaha, and 13 more floated over Utah, a defensive fence painstakingly stitched back together in the very middle of a raging battle, by the same men who had been so confidently expected to break and run. The battalion was later credited with helping to bring down German aircraft over the beachhead, including cutting a wing clean off a Junkers 88, and the man at the very top of the entire Allied command took direct notice of what these soldiers had done. In a formal commendation signed on July 26, 1944, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, wrote that despite the losses it had sustained, the battalion had carried out its mission with courage and determination, and had proven an important element of the air defense team. That is the unit, and that is the mission it accomplished against the odds and against every expectation set for it. Now we return to the single medic, because while the balloon crews were fighting to raise their fence into that hostile sky, Waverly Woodson was somewhere else entirely on that beach, doing something that not even the harshest skeptic in the whole United States Army could ever afterward explain away. Woodson was one of 5 medics from the 320th assigned to a single landing craft, a tank carrier crowded with a Sherman tank, jeeps, trucks, and roughly 50 infantrymen of the 29th Division. The men had endured a long, ugly, seasick crossing of the channel, packed together in the heat. Now, as the craft came in on the rising tide, the German gunners on the bluffs finally found it. A naval mine tore the power straight out of the boat. Then, an 88mm shell struck it square. Woodson described that exact moment himself, decades afterward, and his own words are worth hearing plainly and without any embellishment. "The tide brought us in," he said, "and that is when the 88s hit us. They were murder." He remembered that of the boat's Navy crew, there was very nearly no one left alive, that the shells raked the entire top of the ship from end to end, and that then the mortar rounds began to fall. It was one of those shells that opened his body, driving jagged fragments into his back, his buttocks, his thigh, his groin. Another medic beside him slapped dressings onto the wounds as fast as his hands could move. And Woodson, bleeding freely, half joking against the fear rising in his chest, said only 2 words. "Close," he said. "Mighty close." By every reasonable measure, he should have been a casualty himself at that point. A man to be carried and treated, rather than the man doing the carrying and the treating. Instead, once he was ashore, Woodson and the surviving medics set up an aid station in the meager shelter of the shingle bank, the low ridge of loose stone that ran along the beach near one of the German strongpoints on the eastern end of Omaha. And there, wounded and bleeding through his own dressings, he began to work. He did not stop working for close to 30 hours. The record of what he actually did in those hours is specific and detailed, and it is a very long way indeed from the vague, weightless heroism of legend. He set and splinted broken and shattered limbs. He cleaned and bound wounds torn wide open by shrapnel and by machine gun fire. He dug bullets out of men's flesh with whatever tools he had. He dusted open wounds with sulfur powder to hold off infection. He hung blood plasma and administered transfusions on a beach, where the blowing sand itself was a constant hazard to any kind of sterile work. When there was simply nothing else left to be done to save the life above it, he amputated a soldier's mangled foot. And he did all of this under continuous artillery fire and small arms fire, while his own untreated wounds bled steadily through their dressings, hour after hour after hour, through the daylight and into the darkness, and out the other side into the next day. An army summary of his actions, later quoted directly by the United States Army itself, put the human toll of his work into a single stark sentence. For 30 continuous hours while under enemy fire, it stated, Woodson cared for more than 200 casualties. Let that figure sit for a moment against the scale of the day unfolding around him. Omaha Beach cost the American Army thousands of casualties on June 6th alone. If Woodson personally tended to more than 200 of them with his own 2 hands, then this one wounded medic, drawn from the exact unit the Army had judged unfit for combat, treated a genuinely meaningful share of all the American wounded on the deadliest beach of the entire invasion. I will be honest with you that the precise number is an estimate, one that traces back to Army communications issued in 1944. But it is the Army's own estimate, repeated in the Army's own official histories, and it remains the best attested figure that the surviving record gives us. And even that was not the end of Woodson's day. After he was at last relieved, late in the afternoon of June 7th, he was told that men had gone under the water while trying to get themselves off a foundering landing craft nearby. So he went to them. He pulled them out of the surf and gave artificial respiration to men who had already stopped breathing, and he brought them back to life. The accounts differ on exactly how many men, whether 3 or 4, and on precisely who they were, and I would far rather tell you plainly that the sources disagree than pretend to a certainty the record does not actually hold. But that he revived drowning men after 30 straight hours of field surgery under fire while bleeding from his own unhealed wounds is not in any dispute whatsoever. Only after that, only after the drowning men were breathing again on the sand, did Woodson himself finally collapse from blood loss and sheer exhaustion. He was carried out to a hospital ship and treated for his wounds, and then, just 3 days later, he asked to be sent right back to the beach. The 320th stayed in France for months after the landings, holding its balloons over the beachhead as the supplies of the entire invasion flowed across that same sand behind the advancing armies. And when its work in Europe was finally done, the battalion was not sent home to rest. It was shipped back across the Atlantic, refitted, and sent onward toward the Pacific, staging for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that everyone expected to be even bloodier than Normandy had been. The men of the battalion arrived in Hawaii in the spring of 1945, ready to do it all over again on the far side of the world. The invasion of Japan never came. The war ended first. But the men who had been judged unfit to fight had, by then, been asked to face the enemy on 2 oceans, and had said yes both times. To place what Woodson did into its proper and full frame, it helps to remember what the rest of Omaha Beach looked like on that morning, because he was not laboring at some quiet edge of the battle. He was working directly in the heart of the very worst of it. D-Day was the largest amphibious invasion in the entire history of the world. Around 156,000 Allied troops came ashore across 5 separate beaches, carried and covered by nearly 7,000 vessels of every conceivable kind, and more than 11,000 aircraft filling the sky above them. Of those 5 beaches, Omaha was the killing ground. It was assaulted by the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, and in the first terrible hours, it very nearly failed outright. The German defenses that the bombardment had failed to destroy poured a merciless, interlocking fire straight down onto men who were still wading through the water obstacles, men drowning under the sheer weight of their own soaked equipment before they could even reach the dry sand. In some of the very first companies to land, the casualties ran nearly total within a matter of minutes. By the end of that single day, thousands of Americans had been killed, wounded, or listed as missing on Omaha alone, the highest toll of any of the 5 invasion beaches. And that is the exact ground on which Woodson set up his little aid station and worked without pause for 30 hours. Around 2,000 African-American troops came ashore in total on June 6th, but almost all of them served in the support roles, the stevedores and the truck drivers, and the laborers whose back-breaking work kept the whole invasion supplied and moving forward. The one combat exception, the single black unit whose actual job that first day was to face the enemy directly and hold a fighting position on that sand, was the 320th. Woodson was not a symbol standing safely somewhere behind the lines for the newsreel cameras. He was a wounded combat medic laboring in the deadliest few hundred yards of the entire operation, doing exactly the work that the report of 1925 had solemnly sworn a man of his color could never do. It is worth pausing here on one of Woodson's comrades in that same battalion, because his story runs on a parallel track and sharpens the whole picture. His name was William Dabney, and he was even younger than Woodson. Dabney had enlisted at just 17 years old, before he had even finished high school, and before he was old enough to be drafted, persuading his grandmother to sign the papers that let him go. He was a volunteer, in a war and an army that expected the least of him. The older soldiers around him used to needle him about it. Every time young Dabney complained about the hardship of it all, they reminded him that he had no business being there in the first place, because unlike the drafted men, he had actually chosen this. He had walked in the door on purpose. Dabney served on a balloon crew at Omaha on that same terrible morning. Hot metal struck him in the leg, and the balloon he was tending was shot away from directly above his head. He survived the beach and the war, and then he went home, back to the deep segregation of Roanoke, Virginia. He earned a degree in electrical engineering, only to find that no one would hire a black electrical engineer, so he laid carpet for a living for the next 40 years instead. Decades later, as the last known survivor of the 320th, William Dabney was finally recognized. In 2009, at the 65th anniversary ceremony on the Normandy coast, attended by the presidents of both the United States and France, Dabney received the French Legion of Honor. He died in 2018, at the age of 94. His story is not Woodson's story, but it rhymes with it. Two young black men, doubted before they arrived, doing extraordinary things on the worst beach of the war, and then waiting most of a lifetime for their country and the world to notice. Now, having seen clearly what these men did, you would naturally expect the recognition that followed to be a simple matter. A man performs the way Woodson performed, out in the open, in front of dozens of grateful witnesses, and surely the medals follow as night follows day. That is not what happened. And the reason it did not happen forms the entire second half of this story, the half that even now, in our own time, remains unfinished. Word of what Woodson had done did not stay quiet, not at first and not entirely. In the weeks after the invasion, an account of his actions traveled up the chain of command and out into the press on both sides of the Atlantic. And the paper trail from that summer of 1944 is, quite remarkably, still partly intact today. It is the single strongest piece of evidence we have. It is the reason this account is genuine history, and not merely a warm and inspiring piece of folklore passed down by word of mouth. In late August of 1944, the Army did something it very rarely did in that era. It issued a formal news release, singling out for praise the heroism of, in its own careful and very much dated phrasing, a modest Negro-American soldier. That soldier was Woodson, and the release credited him directly with saving more than 200 casualties on the invasion beaches of France. The military newspaper Stars and Stripes reported that Woodson and his fellow black medics had, in its words, covered themselves with glory on D-Day. The black press across the United States went considerably further still. It called Woodson the #1 invasion hero, and it began, openly and insistently, to campaign for him to receive the very highest award that the nation can bestow for valor in combat, the Medal of Honor itself. And behind all of that public praise, something quieter and far more significant was moving inside the machinery of the government. Here we arrive at the single most important surviving document in the entire case, and at the woman who finally brought it back into the light, more than 60 years after it was first typed. The journalist and author Linda Hervieux, while researching a book about these forgotten soldiers of the 320th, went digging deep through the archives. And at the Presidential Library of Harry Truman, she found a memo. It had been written back in 1944 by a government official named Phileo Nash, a man who worked in the Office of War Information, and it had been addressed to an aide inside the White House itself. The memo recorded a genuinely startling fact. Woodson's own commanding officer had formally recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, which is one of the very highest decorations that the Army is able to award. And then, the memo went on to note, that recommendation had been pushed higher still. The office of a senior general based in Britain had reviewed it and upgraded it, all the way up to the Medal of Honor. The language of the memo is what stops a reader cold, even now, all these years later. This is a big enough award, it read, that the president could give it to the man personally, just as he had, in the words attached to that note, in the case of some white boys. Stapled physically to that memo was an Army press release describing Woodson's actions on Omaha in detail. And that staple is, in the end, how later researchers were able to identify the memo's subject with real confidence, because there was exactly one black medic from the city of Philadelphia serving on that beach, and his name was Waverly Woodson, so the recommendation was real. It was written down at the time by serious people who had no earthly reason to invent it, and a piece of that very paper survives to this day to prove it. And yet Waverly Woodson never received the Medal of Honor. He never received the Distinguished Service Cross in his lifetime either. What he received, for one of the most extraordinary single days of medical heroism performed anywhere on that entire beach, was the Bronze Star, a decoration that sits many ranks below what his own commanding officers had actually asked the Army to give him. To understand how a gap that wide could possibly open up between what a man did and what he received for it, you have to understand what happened over the following decades to the paper. The reason the highest honor never came is not, in the end, a tidy story about a single villain sitting at a desk and signing a single denial. It is a story about missing files. It is a story about how a vast and impersonal system can lose a man's greatest hour somewhere inside its own endless paperwork, and then find itself unable to prove that the hour ever happened at all. Very little of the sheer mountain of documentation that the Army generated during the war ever made its way into a permanent national archive. Records were created by the ton and, in time, discarded by the ton. And then, in 1973, a catastrophic fire tore through the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, the enormous warehouse where the military service files of millions of American veterans were kept. The blaze destroyed a truly staggering share of them. By the common estimate, it consumed around 80% of the relevant Army personnel records from Woodson's era. Whatever had been written down at the time to formally support his nomination, the sworn eyewitness statements, the detailed recommendation itself, the layers of corroborating paperwork that a Medal of Honor absolutely requires, all of it is simply gone. The surviving Nash memo tells us clearly that the recommendation existed and that it was elevated to the highest level. But that single memo, on its own, does not meet the exacting standard of evidence that the Army demands before it will award its highest honor. And so, for decade after decade, the case sat suspended in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. Everyone who looked could plainly see the shape of what had happened on that beach, but no one could produce the actual file that would prove it to the strict letter of the required standard. Woodson, it turns out, was very far from the only black soldier caught in that particular trap. He was one of a great many, and the sheer scale of the omission would, eventually, grow far too large for the country to keep ignoring. Consider the raw arithmetic of the thing. Across the entire span of the Second World War, not one single African American received the Medal of Honor. Not one out of more than 1 million who served in uniform. For half a century, that astonishing record stood completely unbroken, a silence so total and so absolute that it could not honestly be explained by any supposed absence of valor among the men in question. Finally, in the early 1990s, the Army commissioned an independent study, carried out by a team of researchers at Shaw University in North Carolina, to examine directly whether racial prejudice had shut black soldiers out of the nation's highest honor. The study was unable to locate a single document that said, in so many plain words, "Deny this man his medal because he is black." What the researchers found instead was something more diffuse, and in its way more damning. They found a climate, a pervasive racial atmosphere across the entire wartime army, in which such men were simply never put forward for the honor in the first place, or were quietly downgraded to a lesser award, or had their nomination files allowed to lapse and disappear. The scale of the imbalance is easy to state and hard to forget. Across the whole of the Second World War, the United States awarded 432 Medals of Honor. Not a single one of them went to a black soldier at the time. That was the silence the study was finally trying to break. The study recommended a small number of men for belated, long overdue recognition, and on January 13, 1997, President Bill Clinton stood in the White House and awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers of the Second World War. Their names deserve to be spoken: Vernon Baker, Edward Carter, John Fox, Willie James, Reuben Rivers, Charles Thomas, and George Watson. 6 of the 7 were honored after their deaths, the medals received quietly by their families, in a room half a century removed from the battlefields where the men had earned them. Only one of the 7, First Lieutenant Vernon Baker, who had led a fierce assault against a fortified enemy position in Italy in 1945, was still alive to stand there in person and receive the medal himself, 52 long years after the day he earned it. Afterward, Baker spoke of the 6 men beside him who had not lived to see it. "The only thing that I can say to those who are not here with me," he said, "is thank you, fellas, well done, and I will always remember you." Woodson's case was considered during that very same review process. He was not among the 7 men ultimately chosen, and the reason given for leaving him out was, once again, the very same reason: the missing documentation. The fire in St. Louis had reached forward across the decades and shaped what the country was able to prove, in almost exactly the same way that the report of 1925 had once reached forward across the decades to shape what Woodson had been allowed to do in the first place. It is worth naming what the service of men like Woodson eventually helped to purchase, even if they did not live to see all of it. The performance of black soldiers across the whole of the Second World War, in the face of every obstacle their own army placed in their way, became one of the hardest facts for the defenders of segregation to argue around. Men who had been told they could not fight had fought, and had done it well, and had the casualties and the commendations to prove it. In 1948, only 3 years after the war ended, the President of the United States signed an order to desegregate the entire armed forces of the country. That single stroke did not undo the report of 1925, and it did not reach back to give Woodson the commission he had earned and been denied. But it meant that the next generation of black soldiers would not have to fight the same interior war that he had fought. The wall he had run into was, at last, beginning to come down, and his own conduct on Omaha Beach was part of the weight that pushed it over. Woodson lived a long life in the shadow of that unfinished business, and the shape of the life he built for himself is, in itself, a quiet and steady argument against everything he had been denied. After the war, the same man who had performed field surgery under fire on Omaha Beach applied to medical school, the natural next step for a gifted pre-medical student who had already proven his skill under the most extreme conditions imaginable. He was refused admission. He was refused, quite simply, because he was black. So he went back and quietly finished his biology degree at Lincoln University in 1950. When the Korean War came, the Army recalled him to service and assigned him to train a new generation of combat medics, only to reassign him once more, again on account of his race, to run a morgue at a military hospital and perform autopsies there. He rose steadily through all of it to the rank of staff sergeant, and he left the Army for good in 1952. That same year, he married Joanne Snowden, and he spent the whole of the rest of his working life in medicine after all, though never quite as the doctor he had trained so hard to become. He worked in laboratories, in bacteriology, and in clinical pathology, supporting open-heart surgery and other delicate procedures at major American medical institutions for close to 3 decades, before finally retiring in 1980. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the invasion, the nation of France invited Woodson to return to Normandy and honored him for what he had done there upon its shores. He died on August 12, 2005, at the age of 83, and he was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, among the honored dead of the very country he had bled for. He did not, at any point in his long lifetime, receive the medal that his own officers had recommended for him within mere weeks of his heroism. Here, then, is the verdict that the surviving record fully supports, laid out as plainly as it can possibly be. Waverley Woodson did not fail on that beach. His training did not fail him. His courage did not fail him for a single one of those 30 hours. What failed, decades before he ever arrived at Omaha, was a theory. A theory about what a man like him could possibly be capable of. A theory that had been written into an official Army report in 1925 and then enforced across the entire length of his service. That theory held, in cold institutional language, that the black soldier could not master himself in the face of danger, that he lacked initiative and resourcefulness, that he was not, when it came right down to it, the fighting kind. And Woodson spent 30 hours on the sand of Omaha Beach, personally disproving every single clause of it, with his own blood soaking steadily through his bandages, and more than 200 wounded men passing through his hands and coming out the other side alive. The real tragedy of it is not that he was somehow found wanting when the great test finally came. He was not found wanting. He passed the single hardest test the war could possibly have set for any man, and he passed it with a margin almost beyond belief. The real tragedy is that the very system built to recognize and reward valor had been quietly designed, well in advance, in such a way that it could not properly see his. The doubt came first, stamped and filed away in 1925. The proof came second, written in blood and salt water on the sand in 1944. And when that proof outran the doubt so completely that even the man's own commanders reached instinctively for the highest honor the nation possessed, the very paperwork that would have sealed it went up in flames in a warehouse fire nearly 30 years later, and the country lost its own evidence of its own hero. But that is still not quite where the story ends, because other people, in the years that followed, flatly refused to let a missing file be allowed to serve as the final word on Waverley Woodson. And so, over the course of the last decade or so, the record has slowly begun to be set right. Linda Hervieux published her book about these forgotten soldiers of the 320th in 2015, and in doing so she pulled Woodson's name and his deeds back out of the darkness and into the light where they had always belonged. His widow, Joanne Woodson, by then already in her 90s, took up the long fight herself and carried it directly to the halls of Congress. She first walked into the office of her elected representatives that same year, determined that her husband's story would not die quietly with him. A United States Senator from the state of Maryland, Chris Van Hollen, took up the cause alongside her and has pressed it relentlessly for years now. In 2020, Van Hollen, joined by colleagues from both political parties and from both the Senate and the House of Representatives, introduced legislation specifically to authorize the President to award Waverley Woodson the Medal of Honor. The bill drew co-sponsors from across the political spectrum, a rare thing in a divided time, and yet the medal itself did not immediately follow. There was still the problem of the missing file, and there was, for many years, a legal barrier as well. A strict time limit that normally bars the awarding of the Medal of Honor for actions in the distant past. In the National Defense Authorization Act for the 2023 fiscal year, Congress cleared away that particular obstacle, giving the President the specific authority to confer the honor on Woodson without the ordinary restrictions standing in the way. The door, in other words, was deliberately opened. The recognition still has to be walked through it. An Army historian assigned to the effort has spent literally hundreds of hours combing back through whatever fragments of the record still remain, hunting for anything at all that might finally meet the exacting standard. He has not been alone in his conviction. A serving three-star general, the commanding general of First Army, took the extraordinary step of publicly arguing, in print, that Woodson had earned the Medal of Honor and should at last receive it, lending the weight of a modern senior commander to the judgment his commanders in 1944 had reached within weeks of the beach. And piece by piece, decoration by decoration, The recognition that was so unjustly withheld from Woodson during his own lifetime has at last begun to arrive. In 2023, Woodson's Bronze Star and his Combat Medical Badge were at last formally presented to his family in a ceremony at Arlington, honors that had somehow never been properly placed into his own hands while he was alive to hold them. Then, in 2024, on the 80th anniversary of the landings, the Army awarded him, after his death, the Distinguished Service Cross. That was the very honor his commanding officer had first recommended for him back in 1944, before it was pushed higher and then lost to the fire. His widow accepted it on his behalf that autumn. Today, a health clinic at an Army arsenal carries his name, a permanent mark on the country he served, decades after it declined to fully honor him. The Medal of Honor itself has still not come. As things stand right now, it remains the one last piece of justice still outstanding in his case, and the people who understand exactly what he did on that beach are still fighting, to this day, to see it finally delivered. What Waverley Woodson finally leaves behind, then, is a hard question aimed squarely at all the people who were once so very certain about him. They looked at a category on a form, and they never once troubled themselves to see the actual man standing behind it. They wrote down their conclusion before the test was ever administered, and then, when the results came back and proved them comprehensively wrong, they somehow managed to lose those results entirely. A 21-year-old medic, gravely wounded before he had even reached the shore, worked for 30 unbroken hours in the single deadliest place on the face of the earth that day, and he saved more than 200 human lives with his own 2 hands. He was, in the end, exactly the soldier they had sworn up and down that he could never possibly be. The only thing that ever truly slowed Waverley Woodson down was the certainty of the men who assumed, without ever once bothering to look, that he would. If this account meant something to you, consider subscribing so that the stories which were very nearly lost for good can keep finding their way to the people who ought to hear them. Some of the records burned in that fire in St. Louis. This one does not have to burn with them.